When the Aztec Empire fell to Spanish conquistadors in 1521, it marked the end of one world and the beginning of another. What followed was not just a conquest, but a centuries-long transformation of an entire civilization. Spain didn't just take land. It reshaped the culture, the economy, and the people themselves. This is the story of how Spain colonized Mexico, and how, after 300 years, Mexico rose up to reclaim its independence. After the fall of Tenochtitlan, the Spanish wasted no time consolidating their power. They drained the surrounding lakes and built Mexico City right on top of the Aztec ruins, using the very stones of the destroyed temples to construct their cathedrals and palaces. In 1535, Spain officially turned the region into the Viceroyalty of New Spain, placing it under the authority of a viceroy who ruled in the name of the Spanish king. From that moment on, Mexico was no longer a land of independent native cultures. It was now a cornerstone of Spain's growing global empire. But conquest wasn't easy, and it wasn't clean. Although some indigenous groups submitted relatively quickly, others resisted fiercely. The Zapotecs, the Mixtecs, and especially the Maya in the Yucatan held out for decades. The Chichimeca in the north waged a brutal guerrilla war that lasted over 40 years. In the end, Spain couldn't defeat them with force alone. They had to negotiate peace. These long, grinding conflicts showed that colonization wasn't simply about overpowering armies. It was also about outlasting and assimilating cultures over time. With military control established, Spain turned its attention to religion. The Spanish crown and the Catholic Church worked hand in hand to convert the indigenous population to Christianity. Missionaries destroyed temples, burned sacred texts, and outlawed traditional ceremonies. Thousands of native people were baptized, sometimes by force, and churches were built over ancient religious sites. Some missionaries, like Diego de Landa in the Yucatan, were particularly harsh, torturing those who clung to their old beliefs and burning irreplaceable codices, the written records of entire civilizations. But while the Spanish claimed they were saving souls, the human cost was staggering. European diseases like smallpox, measles, and influenza ravaged native populations who had no immunity. Combined with forced labor, displacement, and violence, these epidemics caused a demographic collapse. Before the conquest, the population of what is now Mexico may have been as high as 25 million. By the early 1600s, it had plummeted to less than 1 million. This devastation paved the way for even tighter Spanish control, as indigenous resistance weakened with each passing generation. To exploit the land's resources, Spain established a brutal labor system. The encomienda gave Spanish settlers control over entire native communities, forcing them to work in mines, on plantations, and in construction. It was not slavery in name, but in practice it often was. Over time, some Spanish voices, like Bartolomé de las Casas, spoke out against these abuses. His advocacy helped bring about the new laws in 1542, which aimed to protect indigenous people. But enforcement was weak, and exploitation continued under a different name. The repartimiento, which still required forced labor, just with slightly more oversight. As indigenous labor dwindled due to disease and death, Spain began importing enslaved Africans to meet the growing demand for workers, especially in mining and agriculture. This created a new racial hierarchy in colonial Mexico. At the top were peninsulars, Spanish-born elites. Below them were criollos, or Spaniards born in the Americas. Then came mestizos, people of mixed ancestry, followed by indigenous peoples and African slaves. It was a deeply unequal society, yet over time, new identities began to emerge. Despite the oppression, Mexican society slowly blended cultures, languages, and traditions into something unique. Religion remained central. The Catholic Church became the most powerful institution in Mexico, second only to the crown. Monasteries, cathedrals, and missions dotted the landscape, often built with native labor. But the spiritual conquest was never complete. Beneath the surface, many indigenous traditions survived, often merging with Catholic practices. The Virgin of Guadalupe, for instance, became a powerful symbol of both Christian faith and Mexican identity, believed by many to have appeared to an indigenous man named Juan Diego in 1531. As the centuries passed, cracks in Spain's control began to show. By the 1700s, local elites, the Criollos, grew resentful of Spanish-born officials who held all the top positions. Meanwhile, Spain was facing crises of its own. The Bourbon reforms tried to tighten control over the colonies, raising taxes, expelling the Jesuits, and increasing military oversight. But instead of strengthening the empire, these measures alienated many Mexicans. They planted the seeds of rebellion. Then came the tipping point. In 1808, Napoleon invaded Spain and forced the king to abdicate. A French puppet sat on the Spanish throne. In Mexico, this created a political vacuum. Should they remain loyal to Spain, to a French king, or govern themselves? On September 16, 1810, a priest named Miguel Hidalgo rang the church bells in Dolores and issued a fiery call to arms, the Grito de Dolores. He urged Mexicans to rise against Spanish rule. Carrying a banner of the Virgin of Guadalupe, he led an army of peasants, indigenous people, and disillusioned Criollos. Hidalgo was eventually captured and executed, but his cry had ignited a revolution that could not be stopped. His successors, including José María Morelos, carried the fight forward. In 1813, Morelos declared Mexican independence and called for the abolition of slavery and equality for all races. He was executed, too.